Thank you.
Yeah.
My reflections on education as an oppressor is coming from a background of having analyzed the education systems of my church and my country. In literature review, that the worldviews that are out there actually shape education systems, and they also inform the legal systems of any education or any society. So our focus here is education. In the context of education, these worldviews usually are known as philosophies of education, define what it means to educate. So I'm really not going to dwell now into the meaning of education, but I want to focus in this short period what these education systems are and how they interpret the meaning of education. So the illustration that is shown there is taken from Esteve and other scholars who actually argue that this model of education, if followed, the worldview, the social sciences, the theory, leads into the means and methods of educating. They argue that any transformative education, any education that wants to lead to holistic being is actually informed by the worldview, the context in which that education is done, and the social sciences that surround it. So the argument of this paper, the next slide. The next slide, please. The argument for this paper is focusing on Zambia. And I argue that institutional formal education can be systematically oppressive in its intention for learning. For me, that is key. The institutional formal education can be systematically oppressive in its intention for learning. The example I want to give is that of Zambia. Since 1964, Zambia has tried to have an education that reflects the ideals that it fought for in its independence struggle. So I reflected on Zambia's national anthem. And part of the anthem, the first stanza of the anthem actually states that Zambia is a land of work and unity, victors in the struggle for the right, and that we have won the freedom fight, and that we are all one, strong and free. But considering the education and the system that it uses, the question is Zambia really a liberated country? So in raising that argument, I want to analyze what it means to be free, what it means to be liberated, even from the context of liberation theologies and the philosophies that surround it. One of the education philosophers that has been very prominent in defining the world's education systems is actually John Dewey. Having come from a Christian background, he abandoned his faith at a young age and began to advocate for a progressive philosophy which influenced the education system of that particular time, and which has continued to influence how we educate today. So Dewey's argument that education should be progressive, ideas should be progressive, led the world to begin to define education as problem solving, education as offering skills. And the world believes that an education that focuses on solving problems and an education that is anchored in developing skills can actually transform an individual as well as society that they live in. Let me give an example of Zambia today. Zambia today has an argument actually of Education that is focused on skill training. That is not on the slide. I just want to speak to it based on the paper, on the final paper. Zambia today is arguing for the increase in technical education, believing that in part of our desire to be developed, the more people are trained in skills, the more we'll have people that are running their own businesses and will help to develop the nation. However, my argument is that much as Zambia would desire to have such a developed nation, its education system that is founded primarily on the thought that education should be progressive and bring education has actually been a disappointment in a way, because we, from literature, we observe that Zambia, like many other African nations, looked forward to independent nations that would be able to enjoy the benefits of what it means to be free. And when they realized that they did not have enough educated people, Zambia and its neighboring countries like Tanzania began to posit that there was need to have an education that was actually decolonized, an education that would help the society to be able to evolve. The next slide. An education that would help people to be able to apply their knowledge, their skills to solve the problems that the newly independent countries faced at that particular time. Looking at some of the problems that were defined in the early 1960s, issues of ignorance, issues of poverty, ignorance that is relating to high levels of literacy in our communities, the poverty, the parochial way of doing things, and culture itself has been seen as a hindrance to understanding what it means to be educated. And I would like to point to say something related to culture. In defining culture as being a hindrance to development, we have an education system. We have our countries, African countries, adopting an education system from a Western point of view with a Western culture, and that has been deposited on the natives as a way of defining them, that they are educated, they are progressive, they are developed. So what we find in these education systems that have been adopted in our countries is that it has not solved the oppressive issues that our African states face. The oppressive realities of most of our countries is that poverty continues to increase, violence, wars, corruption, issues that we are battling with to an extent that we begin to raise a question to say, what is the point of education in Africa if it's truly not helping citizens to be self-reliant and to be able to transform their communities? The next slide. Therefore, we see in the context of Zambia that education continues to be oppressive to our society. The problems that Zambia faces are mostly problems that have been perpetuated by the systems of education that we follow, as well as by the fact that politics in Zambia define what it means to be educated. Jean, do I have 2 more minutes? Okay, politics define what it means to be educated. And I would like to bring out an observation from Parker, which shows that when you look at the history of education in Zambia, from the colonial perspective, education was anchored in separate development. That colonial education has actually continued. And in continuing with that colonial education, it is because when nations like Zambia got independence, they did not really change the law. What they changed was just a few changes in words. For example, amending the Education Act of 1953 in order that they could adopt that system to be able to help them to govern the nations. So from that time, Zambia has tried, the next slide, please. Zambia has tried to transform its system of education by defining policies of education, theories of education that have not really been useful to our country. And in all this, I think I argue that the church has played a prominent role, mainly in two ways. The ways that the church has played its role in continuing education that is anchored in capitalist colonial philosophies is that it has been complicit in entrenching a liberal philosophy of education by being uncritical of its intention to educate, and secondly, by its silence. In the Protestant church that I come from, I've yet to come across an ecclesial mission in education that upholds the mission of God. What we have as mission education is that which was inherited from a missionary background. It is that which has was legalized by the colonial frameworks of education, and the subsequent amendments that has been made to the law does not mean that when the church is educating, they are educating in line with the mission of God. So we find that the church today actually needs to redefine its role in education by offering alternative systems. That's what I would argue, whose worldview clearly sets out its agenda to overcome oppressive forces that beset most African countries. This is briefly trying to summarize the thoughts, the main gist of my paper. My presentation ends there.
It's interesting. I could say a lot, but I won't because I have 1.5 minutes. But I think what you highlight is important. And for me, the question was, there's a paradox, because then coming from independence, political independence, how are we supposed to get into economic independence as Africans in Southern Africa? We could decide to do things our own way, African way, but then how do we then relate with the global system, which we unwillingly have become part of? And that's why we need all forms of education. It's difficult, it's complex, but I'm sure that my three sisters are experts in what they're talking about. Thank you, Sione.